By the spring of 1940, Britain's survival came down to a brutal equation. Each month, German U-boats were sending hundreds of thousands of tons of British merchant ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. Food, fuel, weapons, everything the island needed to stay alive, was vanishing beneath the waves. And all the Royal Navy had to defend those vital convoys were about 200 escort ships. 200 to guard an ocean. Winston Churchill, newly appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, looked at the math and saw disaster. In a frantic memo, he scribbled just 3 words that captured Britain's desperation. We need ships, now. The obvious answer was already gleaming in British shipyards. The destroyer. Sleek, deadly, fast. These were masterpieces of engineering, bristling with guns and torpedoes. But they came with a fatal flaw, price and time. Each destroyer cost nearly $1 million, the modern equivalent of $45 million, and took a year and a half to build. At that rate, Britain could produce only a few dozen a year while losing far more merchant ships every month. The math didn't work, and in war, bad math kills nations. Then, in May 1940, as France collapsed and the Atlantic turned red with burning freighters, a quiet naval architect named William Reed offered a solution so strange that most admirals laughed it off. His design wasn't for a warship at all. It came from a commercial whaling vessel he'd spent years refining. A small, sturdy craft called the Southern Pride class. These ships were the polar opposite of destroyers. They were slow, plain, built from common steel and off-the-shelf parts any small shipyard could handle. They had no elegance, no glamour, but they could be built fast and cheap. Just 90,000 each and ready in 8 months. Suddenly the numbers began to shift. For the price of 1 destroyer, Britain could launch 10 of these little ships. For the time it took to build 3 destroyers, they could have 20. Reed wasn't just building vessels. He was rewriting the arithmetic of war. Commander George Cray, head of anti-submarine warfare, understood the idea immediately. The Royal Navy didn't need a few perfect ships. It needed everywhere. Convoys had to be surrounded by escorts, overlapping, forming a living wall of steel. Destroyers were scalpels. What the Atlantic needed was a hammer. And so on July 25, 1940, as the Battle of Britain thundered in the skies, the Admiralty made its bet. 58 of Reed's corvettes were ordered into production. They would be named after flowers: HMS Gladiolus, HMS Bluebell, HMS Campanula. Humble names for humble ships, the flower class. The decision split the Navy. Traditionalists called it madness, trading quality for quantity. These corvettes were half as fast as destroyers, lightly armed and rough at sea. But the alternative was worse: an empty ocean and no protection for Britain's lifeline. By September, the first HMS Gladiolus sailed into the western approaches. She looked like a fisherman's boat that had wandered into a war. Yet within months, ships like hers would prove they could do what Britain's most advanced destroyers could not: keep the nation alive. Meanwhile, across the sea, Admiral Dönitz, the mastermind behind Germany's U-boat fleet, was perfecting his own deadly math. Since 1936, he'd been training his crews in a new way to fight. Gone were the days of lone submarines hunting solo. Instead, Dönitz taught his men to work in coordinated wolf packs. One U-boat would spot a convoy and radio its position. Then others would converge from all sides, attacking together in the night. 6, sometimes 8 submarines striking at once. It was chaos for the escorts. They could be in one place, maybe 2, but not 6. On October 18, 1940, a convoy of 43 merchant ships learned that lesson the hard way. Only 2 escorts stood between them, and 5 German submarines lurking in the cold North Atlantic. By dawn, 21 ships had been sunk. The escorts never had a chance. Churchill saw what this meant, not just for the Navy, but for Britain itself. The Battle of the Atlantic, he called it, the one campaign that truly frightened him. Without supplies, Britain would starve before it could fight back. But the little flower-class corvettes would soon change that. Not by being stronger, but by being everywhere. For centuries, British naval power had been built on excellence. Bigger guns, faster ships, better crews. The corvettes tore up that tradition. They were clumsy, cheap, and noisy. Yet they could be built by anyone, anywhere. And in war, numbers can become their own kind of weapon. By 1941, dozens of these corvettes were already at sea, forming walls of protection across the Atlantic. Slowly, painfully, the balance began to shift. The wolf packs found that their prey was no longer alone. The Royal Navy hadn't built perfection. It had built presence. And in the darkest year of the war, that was enough to keep Britain breathing. The U-boat war was pure mathematics, and the numbers were merciless. One destroyer could chase a submarine, maybe two, but when 6 U-boats struck from 6 directions in the middle of a black Atlantic night, even the finest ship couldn't be everywhere at once. That reality hit home on October 18, 1940. Convoy SC-7, 43 merchant ships hauling food and fuel from Nova Scotia, steamed through icy seas with just 2 escorts to protect them. South of Iceland, 5 U-boats closed in. By sunrise, 21 ships were gone. Fires lit up the horizon. Survivors drifted in oil-slicked water. It was the worst convoy disaster of the war so far. A brutal reminder that Britain was running out of time. Churchill understood the geometry of survival. He even gave it a name, the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the only fight, he later admitted, that truly scared him. Britain needed 55 million tons of imports every year just to survive. Food, oil, steel, ammunition. Without that lifeline, all the courage in the world wouldn't matter. The country would starve before it surrendered. Yet in 1939, the Royal Navy had only 200 escort ships to cover thousands of miles of ocean. Dönitz, Germany's calculating admiral, already had 57 submarines, with more being launched every month. It was a battle of production lines as much as torpedoes, and for the moment the enemy's math looked unbeatable. But then came Britain's counter-equation, the corvette. Not faster, not stronger, just everywhere. The Flower-class corvette didn't defeat the U-boats through superior power. It smothered them with presence. Dönitz's wolf packs depended on surprise and numbers. What happened when convoys sailed not with 2 escorts but 10? When every direction the U-boats turned, another corvette appeared on the radar. The whole balance flipped. In September 1941, a German pack tried to ambush convoy AN-127. Instead of a thin defensive screen, they met HMS Gladiolus, Bluebell, Campanula, Nasturtium, and half a dozen more small ships circling the convoy like guard dogs. The U-boats tried to coordinate an attack, but the corvettes forced them under the surface, breaking their communication and speed. The hunters scattered, and for the first time the wolf pack was on the run. It marked a quiet revolution in naval thinking. For centuries, Britain had worshipped the idea of the perfect ship, faster, heavier, and more powerful than any rival. But the corvette broke that tradition completely. These were ordinary ships for an extraordinary war. They weren't built to win duels. They were built to fill the sea. Admiral Dudley Pound once dismissed them as barely fit for service. He wasn't wrong. On their own, they were slow, cramped, and miserable to sail. But together they changed everything. From late 1940 into early 1941, Britain's merchant losses kept climbing. Dönitz's crews called it the happy time. Sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. But underneath that grim surface, the tide was turning. Each new corvette narrowed the escort gap. Each new launch meant another convoy that wouldn't sail alone. By May 1941, 89 corvettes were patrolling the Atlantic. Convoys that once limped across with 2 escorts now sailed in tight armed packs. The U-boats still struck, but the easy targets were gone. The hunters had become the hunted. And what made this transformation possible wasn't technology. It was simplicity. The blueprints drawn at Smith's dockyard in the summer of 1940 looked more like a fishing trawler than a warship. 205 feet long, 33 feet wide, adapted straight from Reed's old Southern Pride whaling vessels. It was an act of genius hidden inside ordinariness. Reed had taken a proven commercial hull, stripped out the whale tanks, and bolted on guns and sonar. The Admiralty didn't want innovation. It wanted something any shipyard could build with the tools it already had. So Reed's design was intentionally old-fashioned, riveted instead of welded, powered by a single propeller and an engine that could have come out of the Victorian age. That engine was a triple-expansion steam machine, producing just 2,700 horsepower, laughably small compared to a destroyer's roaring turbines. But it had one critical advantage. Britain already had hundreds of them sitting in warehouses. Factories that normally made mine winches and industrial pumps could build Corvette engines without missing a beat. Destroyers demanded specialist yards with deep slips and precision workshops. Only a handful of places in Britain could handle them. Corvettes, by contrast, could be built anywhere. Smith's Dock in Middlesbrough, Hall Russell in Aberdeen, Harland and Wolff in Belfast. Even tiny coastal yards that usually built fishing boats were suddenly building warships. Their steel was the same 3C 8-inch plating used for merchant ships, the rivets straight from civilian suppliers. Reed later joked that his greatest achievement was designing a warship a fisherman could build. And it worked. At John Crown & Sons in Sunderland, teams of riveters assembled hulls in open air, using techniques their fathers had used before the Great War. One man heated the rivets red-hot, two hammered them through pre-drilled plates, and another sealed the head with a pneumatic gun. It was noisy, sweaty, and old-fashioned, but it was fast. On November 12, 1940, they laid down the keel for HMS Campanula. By June 3, 1941, just 7 months later, she was at sea. Compare that to the sleek destroyer HMS Jervis, whose construction stretched over 21 months and required hundreds of thousands of hours of specialist labor. Jervis was a masterpiece, but she was one ship. In the same time, Britain's yards could turn out nearly 50 corvettes using the same total labor. At peak production, Smith's Dock alone was launching a new flower class every 17 days. Riveters who once built fishing trawlers were now launching warships, proof that in the end, survival didn't depend on perfection. It depended on how fast you could build hope that floated. Aboard HMS Gladiolus in November 1940, able seaman Ronald Rundle learned firsthand why veterans called the corvettes the halfway-to-hell ships. The vessel lurched 40 degrees to port, paused for a breathless moment, then slammed 40 degrees to starboard, a full cycle every 8 seconds. This wasn't a storm. This was Tuesday morning in force 6 winds, the kind the North Atlantic delivered 3 times a week without fail. For Rundle and nearly 2/3 of Gladiolus's crew, life aboard wasn't merely uncomfortable. It was a test of endurance. The corvette's short hull and round bottom, inherited from her whaling ship ancestry, gave her agility but no stability. She didn't slice through the ocean, she wrestled it. Every roll sent unsecured mugs, tools, and men tumbling. The deck tilted steep enough that standing upright meant clutching a railing or crawling on hands and knees. Below decks, conditions were worse. Bunks were stacked 3 high in spaces barely wide enough to turn around. The constant vibration from the old triple expansion engine rattled every rivet in the hull. Oil fumes mixed with the stench of wet wool and unwashed bodies. Condensation dripped from the steel ceiling, turning every surface slick with cold sweat. Meals, when they stayed on the plate, were a miracle. Cooking on a ship that pitched like a metronome meant the galley stove had to be chained down. The sailor's favorite joke was that the corvette didn't need depth charges to make a U-boat sick. Just invite the Germans aboard for breakfast. And yet, despite the misery, these halfway-to-hell ships held the line. Their crews, seasick, exhausted, and constantly wet, became the thin gray barrier between Britain and starvation. The corvette was no glamorous warship. She was small, crude, and often despised by her own sailors. But she was also the right ship at the right time. A vessel built not for comfort or prestige, but for survival. Most of Gladiolus's crew spent that watch vomiting into whatever container came to hand. The rest had simply stopped eating. The ship's relentless rolling wasn't bad luck. It was by design. Naval architects had balanced the corvette's stability by placing its machinery low in the hull, but they borrowed hull lines from Antarctic whaling ships, short and broad. With a 6:1 length-to-beam ratio, it made them practically unsinkable by weather alone, yet also ensured they rolled violently in anything rougher than calm seas. Destroyers, long and sleek with 10.1 ratios, cut through the waves. Corvettes didn't cut. They rode them, corkscrewing through every axis. Sailors joked that eating soup required perfect timing. Spoon during the roll's peak, swallow on recovery, and brace for the next swing. Life below deck made it worse. Gladiolus's 85 crewmen crammed into accommodations meant for 47. The forward mess, jammed into the bow where the motion was worst, packed 40 men into a compartment barely 30 feet by 20. Hammocks hung so close, You had to shove through sleeping bodies to move. When Atlantic swells rose past 15 feet, seawater leaked through vents and door seals, soaking the mess in a permanent damp. Nothing ever dried, uniforms, blankets, even skin. Mold crept over boots and bulkheads alike. Lieutenant Commander Henry Chesterman of HMS Campanula reported in March 1941 that 60% of his men suffered saltwater boils, skin infections from wet wool uniforms chafing the flesh raw. The cold was merciless. Corvettes lacked real heating, a design compromise to save weight and money. Tiny coal stoves in the mess decks gave minimal warmth and were banned during U-boat alerts to prevent smoke from revealing the ship's position. Watchkeepers stood 4-hour shifts on open bridge wings, freezing in near-zero temperatures with wind chill far below. Frostbite was routine. January 1942, the medical officer aboard HMS Bluebell treated 12 frostbite cases during a single crossing. It wasn't even worth recording in the ship's log. Then there was speed, nor the lack of it. The Corvette's engines could push 16 knots at best, often less in heavy seas. U-boats on the surface managed 17. A Corvette couldn't chase them. It could only force them to dive, then hunt slowly with sonar and depth charges. Commander Donald McIntyre, escorting convoy HX-112 in March 1941, watched helplessly as U-boats shadowed his convoy just beyond reach, reporting positions and waiting for darkness. When he detached his lone destroyer to pursue, the submarines simply scattered. His corvettes could only lumber forward, soaked, shivering, exhausted. And yet these miserable, slow-rolling vessels performed miracles. In 1941 alone, corvettes spent more days at sea than any other Royal Navy ship type, 240 days per year, compared to 180 for destroyers. They couldn't chase submarines, but they could deny them space, filling the ocean with constant presence. Crews learned to function while perpetually seasick, to sleep in wet clothes, to stand watch until their hands froze to the rail. The Flower-class corvette was hideously uncomfortable, tactically flawed, and crewed by men who deserved far better. Yet those men saved Britain. HMS Gladiolus claimed her first kill on March 16, 1941, the legendary U-47, commanded by Gunther Prien, the same ace who had sunk HMS Royal Oak at Scapa Flow. Gladiolus detected him at 400 yards, closed through rough seas, and dropped 14 depth charges in a perfect diamond pattern. U-47's hull imploded at 180 feet. Prien and his 45 crew were lost. Britain had spent 35 pounds worth of depth charges to destroy Germany's most famous U-boat commander. The cost-to-kill ratio was staggering, and the pattern only intensified. Bluebell sank U-651 in June 1941. Campanula destroyed U-74 that May. Narcissus claimed U-568 in October. By year's end, corvettes had accounted for 19 confirmed U-boats, more than all British destroyers combined. The secret wasn't superior tactics. It was mathematics. Destroyers spent 60% of their time in port for refits and maintenance. Corvettes with simple engines and minimal systems stayed at sea 70% of the time. More days at sea meant more encounters. More encounters meant more kills. U-boats learned to dive immediately at the sight of a corvette. Not out of fear, but because corvettes were always there. Once submerged, the tables turned. Underwater, U-boats slowed to 7 knots, while corvettes could still make 16. Escort groups learned to hunt by endurance, quartering the sea patiently, forcing U-boats to remain submerged until their batteries died or their air turned foul. Commander Peter Gretton of the B-7 Group called it terrier tactics. We couldn't outrun them, so we outlasted them. HMS Gladiolus herself was lost on October 16, 1941, torpedoed by U-568 south of Iceland. She sank in 4 minutes, taking 80 of her 85 crew. Her story was tragically common. The corvette's thin, riveted plating could not withstand a direct hit. Between 1940 and 1945, 47 Flower-class corvettes were destroyed. 22 by U-boats, 11 by aircraft, 7 by mines, 4 in surface action, and 3 by collision. Each loss cost roughly 65 lives. The human toll was appalling, but Britain built replacements faster than the enemy could sink them. By mid-1942, the Royal Navy fielded over 200 corvettes. The final tally, published in 1946, was astonishing. Flower-class corvettes had fought in actions that destroyed 294 U-boats, 47 solo, 247 shared. No other Allied surface warship class came close. Destroyers sank 174, frigates 187. Aircraft took the top spot with 386, but corvettes, the smallest, slowest, and most despised ships in the fleet, stood second. Commander Donald McIntyre, who personally sank 5 U-boats while commanding corvette groups, summed it up best. Their success came from being everywhere the U-boats never expected us, because we were cheap enough to send everywhere. Britain's gamble had paid off, brutally, brilliantly, and decisively. By war's end, the Royal Navy had lost 47 corvettes, ships that together cost barely £4 million to build. Those same vessels helped sink nearly 300 German U-boats, worth more than $70 million. Each German Type 7 submarine cost $250,000 to produce, and each carried 50 highly trained sailors who took 9 months to prepare. When those boats went down, Germany didn't just lose steel. It lost experience, and those men could never be replaced fast enough. In the end, the U-boat arm was destroyed not by better technology or superior firepower, but by relentless numbers, by humble little corvettes that simply refused to give the ocean back to the enemy. The German Type 7 was, by any measure, a masterpiece of engineering. Fast on the surface, deadly underwater, and armed with acoustic torpedoes that could home in on the sound of a propeller. It carried an Enigma machine, linking whole wolf packs across thousands of miles with coded precision. Each one took 16 months to build, drawing on parts from nearly 30 factories. They were marvels, but they were marvels built too slowly. Even at the height of production, Germany could only turn out about 25 U-boats a month. Britain, meanwhile, had learned the hard lesson of survival. You don't need perfection, you need presence. Between 1940 and 1945, British and Canadian shipyards launched 267 Flower-class corvettes and another 151 Castle-class successors. Over 400 ships built to one guiding principle: make them simple enough that anyone, anywhere, could build one fast. On paper, the numbers still seemed uneven. Germany commissioned 1,153 U-boats in total, but most of them spent 60% of their time tied up in port, refitting, repairing, or waiting for new crews. Only 40% were ever at sea at once. Corvettes, by contrast, were nearly always moving. They spent 70% of their lives on the water, and they hunted in packs of their own, small escort groups that worked together like a single organism. The true balance of power wasn't 153 against 400. It was closer to 460 U-boats versus 290 corvettes, many of which could be in 2 or 3 convoys at once thanks to overlapping routes. And unlike Germany's submarines, when a corvette was lost, another took its place within months. When HMS Campanula was sunk in June 1942, Smith's Dock laid down her replacement within 3 weeks. The new Campanula joined the fleet that November, barely 5 months later. When Germany lost U-135 that same summer, work on her replacement began immediately. It took over 2 years to commission the new U-1065. That was the difference between industrial war and engineering pride. British shipbuilding had turned into something resembling a car factory. Corvettes were built from standardized parts, interchangeable fittings, and blueprints designed to work in any shipyard. Dozens of small yards that once built fishing boats or freighters now turned out warships by the week. Germany, by contrast, remained trapped in its obsession with craftsmanship. Each U-boat was hand-built, full of custom components requiring specialist teams. You couldn't build them in parallel. Every boat had to be finished before the next could begin. The same contrast appeared in repairs. Corvette engines were old-fashioned, simple, and tough, built from merchant-grade machinery. When HMS Bluebell threw a connecting rod in 1942, shipwrights in Londonderry replaced it with a spare from a laid-up freighter. She was back at sea in 4 days. A destroyer with a damaged turbine would have been out for 6 weeks. That kind of simplicity didn't just save time. It won the war. By 1943, the Admiralty's own statistics showed corvettes averaged just 22 days between port calls, compared to 14 for destroyers, despite operating in the harshest conditions on Earth. They were ugly, Noisy and slow, but they were always there. Germany never truly adapted. Admiral Dönitz pleaded for smaller, faster submarines that could be built in bulk, but Grand Admiral Raeder refused. The Kriegsmarine clung to its philosophy of technical perfection, even as it drowned beneath it. When Germany finally tried to change course, it was too late. The new Type 21 submarines were marvels of design, capable of higher speeds underwater than on the surface, able to stay submerged indefinitely using snorkels. But each one took nearly 2 years to build. Only 118 were completed before the war ended, and none became operational in time to matter. They were magnificent, yes, but they were magnificent failures, masterpieces that missed their moment. Britain had gone the other way. It built good enough ships fast enough to matter. The early Flower-class corvettes were crude and miserable to live on. But the lessons came quickly. The improved models of 1942 added heating, better crew quarters, and heavier anti-aircraft guns. The Castle class of 1943 went further. Sleeker hulls to cut down on rolling, stronger engines for 20-knot speed, and the new squid mortar system that could fire depth charges ahead of the ship instead of behind it. Each version wasn't perfect, but it was ready. And that was Britain's real secret weapon in the Atlantic. A willingness to fight with what was available now, not what might be ideal later. Quantity didn't just have a quality of its own. It became the quality that saved Britain. It became the quality that saved Britain. When people think of the Battle of the Atlantic, they imagine mighty warships, sleek destroyers slicing through rough seas, hunting German U-boats with deadly precision. But in truth, Britain's survival didn't rest on the fastest or the fiercest. It depended on something far more ordinary. A fleet of small, ugly, and endlessly seasick little ships called corvettes. These vessels weren't built by elite naval shipyards. They came from commercial docks, staffed by welders borrowed from shipbreaking yards and fitters who usually worked on trains. None had naval certification, and that was the point. The plan was simple: build many, not perfect. By late 1941, over 150 corvettes were already patrolling the Atlantic, sealing the deadly gap where German submarines had once hunted freely. The Royal Navy had traded elegance for efficiency, and that decision would end up reshaping the war. Perfection versus production. Take the destroyer HMS Electra, a marvel of modern engineering, fast, armed to the teeth, bristling with sensors and sonar. She cost nearly $1 million and took 1.5 years to build. When she was sunk in early 1942, that was 18 months of effort gone in 7 minutes. That was the cruel math of war. Britain could not afford to lose ships that took years to replace. So the Admiralty made a brutal calculation. One destroyer could buy 10 corvettes. The destroyer might win a single brilliant battle, but 10 corvettes could guard 10 convoys every single day. Convoy protection wasn't about glory. It was about presence, being everywhere at once. And that's exactly what the corvettes provided. Quantity over quality. These little ships were crude, cramped, and violently unstable. Crews called them halfway to hell because they rolled so fiercely that men slept strapped into their bunks. Yet they stayed out there, day after day, chasing shadows across the gray Atlantic, throwing depth charges at unseen submarines. When a corvette was sunk, another replaced it within weeks. When a destroyer went down, its replacement took 2 years. The numbers spoke for themselves. Britain could replace 47 corvettes for the cost of just 4 destroyers, and still have shipyards left to build something else. And that something else turned out to be the rest of the war effort. Tanks, aircraft, landing craft, and bombers that would later crush Nazi Germany. The math of survival for Germany, the opposite was true. Their U-boats were masterpieces, deep-diving, silent hunters built with precision engineering. But they took too long to make. Even at full speed, German yards could turn out only 24 a month. Britain's shipbuilders could launch corvettes faster than Germany could replace lost submarines. That imbalance decided the Atlantic. Britain could keep replacing its losses. Germany could not. A U-boat cost around $250,000 and needed a full crew of skilled submariners who trained for nearly a year. When those men and machines were lost, they stayed lost. By contrast, when a corvette sank, the Admiralty had another nearly ready to launch. It wasn't a fair trade, it was an economic onslaught. By 1943, Admiral Dönitz's U-boat force was bleeding out. Corvettes had turned the hunters into the hunted. Simple ships, endless impact. The genius of the Corvette wasn't what it could do, it was how many could do it. They were built like cars on an assembly line. Engines came from merchant ships. Replacement parts could be scavenged from any dock. Repairs that might sideline a destroyer for weeks could be done on a Corvette in days. They weren't elegant, but they worked. And they were always ready. By 1944, Britain had nearly 300 of them at sea, enough to blanket the Atlantic in overlapping sonar screens. U-boats could no longer find undefended convoys because there were none left to find. The war of attrition was over. The side that could stay in the fight longest had already won. The price of good enough. When the bills came due in 1946, Britain realized the miracle it had pulled off. The entire Corvette program, over 400 ships, had cost just over $45 million, barely 3% of the Royal Navy's wartime budget. If Britain had tried to achieve the same coverage with destroyers, it would have cost 60 times more. A financial black hole that could have crippled the country before victory was possible. That saved money went elsewhere, to D-Day's landing craft and tanks, to the Mediterranean campaign, to the bombers that finally broke Germany's industrial heart. In the end, the Corvettes didn't just defend Britain's convoys, they defended Britain's ability to fight at all. The legacy, by the summer of 1943, U-boat losses skyrocketed. Convoys were sailing safely. For the first time, Britain could feed itself and prepare for the final push into Europe. The mighty destroyers remained powerful symbols of naval mastery, but it was the small, stubborn, cheap corvettes that kept the nation alive long enough for victory to arrive. War, it turned out, wasn't won by the perfect ship. It was won by the ship that could be built fast enough, often enough, and cheaply enough to keep fighting. The Corvettes didn't just save convoys. They saved Britain. They saved Britain.